Hello and welcome to Unearth the Past, a brand new genealogy and family history podcast brought to you by me, Dr. Michaela Hume. So, have you taken a DNA test? I bet you have. I think most people have taken a DNA test nowadays. Well, you may have questions about DNA and about how it works. Well, this week, folks, you are in for a treat. I have got a DNA expert with us. That's right, I've got the absolutely fabulous Laura House, who's going to talk to us about DNA and tell us how it works. Laura, thank you so much for joining us on this week's podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I remember when this whole DNA testing thing came out, and I think it was Ancestry who sent me some DNA kits. And I do a couple of local radio shows up here in the Northwest, and I said we'll do it as part of the show. We'll take our DNA and we'll get our ethnicity breakdown. So I was literally going round to my mates who present these shows and getting them to spit in a tube, Laura. I think they thought I'd lost my mind. I'm sure they will admit that I taught some of them how to spit. I'm not saying I'm a good spitter, but I was going around and getting them to spit in tubes and saying, no, you can't eat so much before you take the test, and we don't want any bubbles, get rid of the bubbles. So let's start right from the beginning. So the pack has arrived, the DNA test has arrived at our home. It's on the table. What happens? What's the process?
I actually have a kit right here if you'd like me to walk you through it.
Yes.
Here's what I made earlier.
So if you are watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see Laura literally showing us what to do. If you are just listening to the audio, we're going to be talking you through it. Laura is now opening the box and we're going to see what is inside.
This is like an unboxing video. You could do some ASMR.
It is, isn't it?
So in the box you get the spit tube.
Okay.
Try not to corrupt this because I probably want to use it at some point.
Yep.
So you got your spit tube and it's got a funnel at the top to make it easier. And the first thing that people always say when they see this tube is, oh my God, it's massive. How am I supposed to fill this tube? I've only got one mouth. But actually, you're only supposed to spit a tiny, tiny amount. It's about a teaspoon, I think. And it only goes from here to here. So it's a very, very small amount on the tube. And it's if you do have trouble spitting, there are techniques you can use to help it come along a little bit. So you can sniff a lemon.
Oh, okay. So Laura is now going to provide us, folks, with tips to help us spit. Right, so go for it. Tip number 1.
So, if you cut a lemon in half or anything sour, that can, the smell of it can get the saliva flowing. And this, you might think it's gross, but this is really important for testing older relatives because a lot of older people struggle to produce the necessary amount of saliva, either just because they're elderly or because they're on medication. Anyone who's on chemotherapy can sometimes struggle as well. And it's chemotherapy can damage the DNA anyway, so you want to make sure you get a good sample from someone who's on chemo. So there's so many reasons that someone might struggle to produce a sample. So anything you can do to make sure it hits that line is great. So smelling a lemon. Another thing people do is if you take a tiny little bit of sugar and just put it on your tongue, that can help things out a little bit as well. Try not to do anything that will contaminate the sample. So you don't want to fill your mouth too much. My nan, when I gave her the test, she actually licked the lemon, which she was trying to help. She thought it might help, but you don't want to do that. You don't want to lick the lemon. So then you have, there's a biohazard bag that you put your sample into afterwards to keep it safe. And once you've finished spitting, there is a lid. You have this lid here, and it includes the DNA preservation fluid that keeps your sample safe on its journey to the lab. So you put that on the top once you're done, and you squeeze it really tight until the fluid goes into the tube.
And then you pop it in the post?
Yeah, it comes in a prepaid. Most of the kits now, I think, come in prepaid postage boxes that you can just put straight in the post, and they go straight to the lab. And then in about 6 to 8 weeks, at most companies, the results come back, and they're split into several different categories. So the first is the ethnicity estimate. I'll use Ancestry as an example. I work for Ancestry, full disclosure. So I'll use them as an example. And they give you the DNA story, which shows you the populations that your DNA most closely resembles. So it'll be countries: England, Wales, Ireland, Senegal, China, etc. And then there's genetic communities, and these refer to the locations in which your living relatives or the recent ancestors of your living relatives, where they have migrated to. So, for example, my grandmother is from the Canary Islands, and so I have a genetic community in Cuba and Puerto Rico. I don't have any ancestors in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but there was a mass migration from the Canary Islands to those countries. So I have a community there because I have hundreds of DNA matches who now live in those countries. And that's how the communities work.
Okay, so I just brought up my ethnicity estimate. That is a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? My ethnicity estimate. And I am 37% England and Northwestern Europe. I'm just getting a bit boring. 30% Scottish, 22% Ireland, 7% Wales, and 4% Sweden and Denmark. I've yet to find anybody from Scotland in my family tree. I have got Ireland. I haven't got Wales yet. And I've got nobody from Sweden and Denmark. So there are going to be people who get their results back. And that's actually a question that we had in from a listener, which I'll ask you in a second, whose ethnicity estimate doesn't match their family tree. Does that seem right to you, Laura? Like, is there a reason for that? Is that because this is going way further back than my family tree, if that makes sense?
There is a reason for it, and it's a good question. The way this technology works is every DNA testing company has their own reference panels. And the reference panels are groups of people who have been deliberately tested to represent specific populations around the world. And so there will be a reference panel representing Scottish DNA, and there will be a reference panel representing English DNA, and so on. So when you take a test, you are compared against all of these reference panels. And it's not so much that your DNA comes from these countries as that your DNA that your DNA resembles the DNA of people in these countries. So any country with a history of migration with its neighboring countries, or a country that has strong trade links going way back with other countries, the DNA is going to look really similar, and it's going to be almost impossible to distinguish it. So a huge number of English people get an exaggerated percentage of Scottish DNA because we've had such close ties with Scotland for hundreds of years that, especially if you come from specific parts of the UK, the DNA is almost indistinguishable from Scottish DNA. It's not like you pop over the border and suddenly the DNA looks completely different. That's quite an unusual situation. And it only happens in isolated populations, which, especially on the border with England, Scotland's not isolated. So that is why you get these sorts of results. And if you're from specific parts of the UK, you're more likely to get Nordic DNA in your results as well, because we've always had links with Norway, Sweden, and really all the countries in Europe. So you could end up with anything if your DNA resembles lots of different populations. But typical British Isles heritage, that's what you would expect to see. Ireland, England, Scotland, Sweden, and Norway. Yeah.
Now, I have a great grandmother, to get this right, who is Kajowski, who I think is Polish. Birth certificate just says born over Spanish waters anywhere. I'm not really seeing her represented in my results.
So you probably know that you get exactly 50% of your DNA from each person. and you get roughly 25% from each grandparent, roughly 12.5% from each great-grandparent, and roughly 6.25% from each great-great-grandparent. So you would expect to see something in your ethnicity estimate representing this lady. What I recommend in cases like these is not to be led by the ethnicity estimate, but to be led by your DNA matches, which is a good segue into DNA matches, which is the other part of your DNA results. So when you take a DNA test, you're matched with every single person in the database with whom you share a meaningful amount of DNA. And these are your genetic relatives. And with any kind of mystery, whether it's ethnicity related or otherwise, always be led by the DNA matches first and foremost. What you want to see is a group of DNA matches associated with this lady. Right. And that is how you will get to the bottom of where she's really from.
Sorry to interrupt, just a quick note from me. If you are enjoying this podcast and you would like to support the making of this podcast, please visit my Patreon account. It's www.patreon.com/Dr. Michaela Hume. Don't forget to make sure you download the podcast if you are listening to it. And if you are watching it on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thank you. I have a question from somebody who said, this is one of our listeners, would you get the same result if a brother and sister take the test and got the same parents? Would you get the exact same results?
That's such a great question. Not exactly. So full siblings will share approximately 50% of their DNA with each other. So there's a whole 50% that's different that each sibling brings to the table. And this is why if you have one or both parents deceased, it's really important to test all your siblings if you can, because that way you get as much of your parents' DNA into the database as possible. So although you get exactly 50% of your DNA from each parent, you get a slightly different 50% from each parent. So they take the DNA of their parents, they shuffle it up, and they give you half. And then they take the DNA of their parents, they shuffle it up, and they give your sibling a different half. So there's always about 50% overlap between the four siblings, but there's also going to be a 50% difference. So they will have matches you don't have. They might have bits of their ethnicity estimate that you don't have. And sometimes you'll get a match and you'll think, oh, that's really high, or actually, no, that's quite distant and not as close as I was expecting. But your sibling will balance it out. Your siblings' results will show that this match is actually really close or really distant in line with your expectations. So as with anything scientific, the more data you get, the better. Get as many results as you can so that you can really see what's actually going on. And siblings are really useful to test because they bring so much more of the ancestral DNA into the database.
You know, I didn't think of it like that. I think when I first started using DNA years ago, I just assumed, I mean, look, I'm not a scientist. When I'm not doing genealogy, I'm a historian. I think I just assumed that if you and your brother had the same mum and dad, then your ethnicity estimates and everything just would be identical. So there's no point you doing it because I've done one, you know. And it's so great to chat to you, Laura, because the more I learn about DNA, the more, in order to get that fuller picture, you all need to ideally do a DNA test.
Yeah, that's right. The one thing I would say is if you test both parents, you don't really need to test the kids because you don't have any DNA that parents don't have. So if you want to cut on costs and you've got two parents living, then just test the parents. If you've got a full set of grandparents, just test the four grandparents. But of course, whichever generation is the oldest, if they've got siblings, test those siblings. If you've got grandparents with siblings, test everyone, test all of them, test your aunts and uncles, test everyone that's alive and willing to take a test and get as much of that ancestral DNA as you possibly can.
Have you done your DNA?
Yes, of course.
Did you have an idea of what your breakdown would be before you took the test?
Yeah, I did know already, roughly, because I was already doing family history research before I took a DNA test. And like most people, I started as a hobby, but I wasn't doing it as a hobby for very long before I decided to go professional. So I enrolled in the postgraduate course at Strathclyde to study genealogy at the postgraduate level. And as soon as I could, I specialised in genetic genealogy. So I'd already done some research when I first started testing my family. So I tested my grandparents first because that was the priority. Needed to get that done as quickly as possible. And then I tested my parents, and then I tested myself. So I knew roughly what to expect from the documentary side of things. But there were some surprises. I found out that my grandma's father was not her father. So that was unexpected. And it looks like, so we thought she was completely Spanish, but it looks like her dad might have been Portuguese or part Portuguese.
So when your nana took this DNA test and it came back that her dad wasn't her dad, and this isn't the first one, if my listeners are probably thinking, again, because I had Paul O'Neill on, who is one of the experts with me on DNA Journey, on last week's podcast, and he found the same. When he took a DNA test, he couldn't believe it. His dad was not his dad was not his biological father, if that makes sense. Still his dad, but biologically, is not his father. So how did your nana react when she got the news? Was she surprised? Is it something maybe she suspected?
Well, actually, this was my late grandmother. So on my dad's side, my nan is still alive and she took a test. And then on my mum's side, this is my mum's late mother. So we found this out because my mum tested and her aunt tested, and they came back with a half aunt, half niece relationship. And that was our first tip off. And then we needed to figure out, was it my great aunt who was born from a different man, or was it my grandmother who was born from a different man? So we enlisted the help of some cousins, and they all agreed to test. They were all really on board. And then the test results came back and they all matched each other fully. And we were the half branch. So we knew then that it was my grandma. So she never got to find out, which is quite sad, really.
Have you found it's made the genealogical research quicker using the DNA as opposed to sort of paper records?
Definitely. The vast majority of my client work, so I work for Ancestry Pro Genealogists, and the vast majority of my client work is unknown paternity. So most of my clients come to me because they're looking for an unknown parent. Sometimes it's an unknown mother as well. Usually it's an unknown father or an unknown grandparent. And that kind of research wouldn't even be possible without DNA. There would be nowhere to go. There would be no records. There are no records. There would be nothing we could do to connect the biological parent to the child. There's no documented connection that exists on the planet. And if it wasn't for DNA testing, people with unknown parentage would have literally no options. There'd be nothing they could do. And it's an absolute miracle that this technology exists. And the fact that we're only at the forefront of this process, that, the genome was only fully sequenced in 2000. We're right at the start of this journey. The first direct-to-consumer DNA test was sold a year later, I think in 2001. We're right at the beginning here. This is early days. And who knows what's going to be possible years from now. So this is incredibly exciting technology. And something I feel very, very strongly about is that everyone should get the opportunity to know who they are and where they come from. And what particularly bothers me is that there are people in the world who don't realize that this is an option for them. They think that, I don't know who my parents are. Genealogy isn't for me. There's nothing I can do. I'll never find out who my parents are. And they don't realize that this is something that can be achieved using DNA testing. So I think getting the word out about that is especially important. And I use DNA in my normal cases as well. It absolutely speeds things along. So it helps to verify the paper trail research. Often in a traditional genealogical case, I'll start with paper trail, find the documents first, and then I'll look at the DNA results and ensure that nothing is contradicting the paper trail research. But I will always be led by the DNA, in that if the DNA is telling me that the paper trail is wrong, then I will lean towards the DNA on that, and I will look into it further and figure out why the DNA is telling me that. So it's a very different approach, and it's an approach that some genealogists aren't comfortable with yet, to be led by something other than documentary research and to put trust in something that's so new and works in such a different way. I think it's quite alarming for a lot of people, but it's very good, and it's very accurate, which is the most important thing, I think.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, you can lie on a piece of paper but DNA doesn't lie. If somebody out there who's listening today may not know who their birth parents are, they may not be able to afford to pay for a genealogist to do this, but they've taken a DNA test, what should they be looking out for in their results to try and help them on that journey to try and discover more about themselves?
The first thing you want to look at when you get your DNA results is which of your matches share DNA with each other. So on Ancestry, for example, there is a tool that allows you to group your matches using color coding. Now, a trap that a lot of people fall into is they do something like they search their entire match list for people with the surname Smith, and then they put everyone into a Smith group. Do not do that. You can't be led by surnames. You can't even be led by family trees. You have to be led by the DNA itself. So take your closest match, put them into a little group, call them unknown group 1 or whatever, and then look at all the matches you share with that person and add them to the same group. You all share DNA with each other. They all share DNA with each other. At some point in history, all of you have a common ancestor. So then you go to your next match who doesn't share DNA with that first group. And you repeat that process. You make unknown group 2. And you make a new group of matches. All of you share DNA with each other. None of you share DNA with group 1. So, or none of them share DNA with group 1. You do, but they don't. So you make separate and distinct groups of DNA matches, all of whom share DNA with each other within the group, but none of whom share DNA with anyone in any of the other groups. They have to be distinct. So these are your family groups. And in theory, if you're dealing with an unknown parent, you'd expect one of these groups to be perhaps related to your unknown parent's grandfather, and another to be related to their grandmother, and another to be related to their other 2 sets of grandparents. So that's why they don't share DNA with each other, because these are distinct groups, each one being related to a separate branch of the unknown parent's tree. The second thing you want to do is you want to look at each of these groups of matches that you've created, and you want to figure out who their common ancestors are. That's when you can look at their trees. Once you know that 2 people share DNA with each other, then you can look at the trees and identify who their shared ancestors are. If you can't see who their shared ancestors are and you're feeling savvy, try and trace their tree yourself if you feel confident doing that. If you don't,
can I just say, I've done that before because I'm such a wimp. I thought I could just email them and say, please can I have a look at your tree? And then I thought, no, you know what? I'm just going to recreate their tree myself.
I always go for recreating the tree first, because a lot of people aren't responsive, and also I have terrible social anxiety and I don't want to talk to anyone. So
yeah,
that's always the route I take. I always go for making the tree myself, and only in extremis will I then message someone and say, please, I need you. My client is looking for an unknown parent, and that we would really appreciate your help. And then we get whatever information we can from this person, and we build their tree based on that information until we identify the ancestors they share with the other matches in their group. But then when you've got a common ancestor for your group, the next thing you need to figure out is whether you could possibly be descended from that couple.
And that is exactly what I did when I was doing the case. It was only a couple of months ago. The guy who was looking for his birth father was to put them into groups. Once I'd grouped them and colour coded them, it was then so much easier for me to figure out how they were related. So when you get your results, if it's a close, if you share a lot of DNA, it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? It will say this is a parent. But obviously, as the DNA gets less, the markers are less. Is that right, Laura? Am I on the right tracks with that?
Yeah, exactly. The closer the relationship is, the less ambiguity there will be. So if you get a match, and so shared DNA, when you look at the DNA you share with someone, that's measured in a unit called centimorgans. So when I refer to centimorgans, I'm talking about the quantity of shared DNA. And if you get a match and they share 3,500 centimorgans with you, that is a parent or a child. And you've got to use context clues to figure out which. So hopefully you'll be able to figure that out pretty quickly. And then if you share maybe 1,500 centimorgans of DNA, that's about a half sibling. Or it could be an aunt or an uncle or a niece or a nephew. or a grandparent or a grandchild. So the more distant it gets, the wider the range of possible relationships for any given quantity of DNA. But you will be able to figure it out using context. If you have an unknown parent and you get a DNA match and they share 1,500 centimorgans with you and you do not recognize their name and you look at their tree and they're roughly the same age as you, that's a half sibling, right? So then you know that this person has the information you're looking for. This person's dad is your dad.
Mm.
And then this has happened remarkably often that we've come to this point, and it's a terrifying moment, because that's the moment where you feel like this is your one chance and you can contact this person, and it could be a half sibling, it could be a cousin, it could be an aunt or an uncle, but it's a close relative who has everything that you're looking for. And this is your one chance to start that conversation, and the pressure is on and you don't want to blow it and you don't want to burn any bridges. And this is an incredibly intense moment for a lot of people when they take that test and they get a match who's close enough that they could give them everything that they're looking for. It's a lot.
It's difficult as well, isn't it? Because often there is a chance that the person who has also taken the DNA test, if it's potentially a half sibling, may not know anything about you. So, you always have to tread very carefully in those cases. I did a case for a radio station of a gentleman who took a DNA test and didn't realise that he actually had a daughter who'd also taken a DNA test. I think he had fathered while travelling when he was young. And they met up, I think it was last year now. The lady travelled to meet her biological father, but neither of them knew anything. Obviously, she knew that, somewhere out there was her dad, but he had no idea that he had a child until he had taken the DNA test that was probably bought to him, for a Christmas present, birthday
Happy
present.
Christmas.
Yeah, happy Christmas, and here's your daughter.
Yes.
Yeah. Always expect surprises. I mean, you had a surprise, didn't you, Laura, in your family tree when you took the DNA test?
I had several.
Did you? Did you have several?
Yeah, and they keep coming.
Really?
The more you look, the more you get.
Again, you just don't know, do you, what's in your family tree until you start looking.
That's what makes it so exciting. I think if you're the sort of person who loves to get to the truth of things, the real truth of things, there's nothing more exciting in the world than taking a DNA test, because it brings you that truth. And of course, the people who take a DNA test are a self-selecting group. Mm. So if you are looking for an unknown parent, your best odds of connecting with your family are via someone who's taken a DNA test, because by their very nature, they're a person who was curious about what's out there and who they might find and who they might meet. And the reverse is true. You're more likely to find, if you've got half siblings, there's a good chance that they're going to be in that database, because they're going to be interested in their history. They're going to be curious.
What is really nice for somebody who doesn't know their family is to see that cousin match. They may have been adopted. They don't know who their birth parents are. They may feel that they have no connection to their adoptive family. You just don't know. But to actually see a cousin match, that is your blood relative. That is somebody who biologically is related to you. You share DNA with that person. No matter how small, you share DNA with that person. And for some people, not everybody, but for some people, I think that brings them some comfort.
Yeah, for a lot of people, for adoptees especially, that will be the first time they've ever seen a genetic relative.
So, Laura, I've had a question sent in, and this is from somebody who contacted me via email. And they say, my husband has had his DNA tested and his ethnicity estimate is 48% Ireland, 28% England and Northwestern Europe, and 24% Scotland. Now, the 28% England and Northwestern Europe has been assigned to Devon and Cornwall. However, this person's husband's mother was born in Cork, Ireland. And the tree has been traced, and it's apparent from her line, it's well established that they're Irish going back generations after generations. So she expected when her husband did his family tree that he would have a higher Irish ethnicity percentage than what he's got. Now, his Irish ethnicity on his test is assigned to coming from his mother, whilst English and Scottish comes from his father, and yet his father had an Irish mother who she thinks was born in County Wicklow. So what she thinks be that her husband's father is not his biological father. And she thought, as I say, that the ethnicity matches, especially for Ireland, would have been higher than what they are. So could we shed any light on that? Have we got any idea why we think that may be?
Yeah. So it's always difficult, obviously, to comment on a specific case without seeing the results. But my advice would be that the ethnicity estimate can be a red flag and it can tip you off, but it shouldn't be the be all and end all. You need to then look at the matches, which it sounds like she has done. And what she needs to look for is an absence of evidence is not evidence in itself. So if he is lacking matches from his father's line, that is not evidence in itself. But he should have matches on his paternal side. She needs to look at the matches that are on the husband's paternal side. So first, look at the maternal ones, group those, separate them, get them out of the way, forget them. And then she needs to group her husband's paternal matches and treat them as she would if her husband had unknown paternity, if she had no idea what she was looking for. Don't go in there with any preconceived bias. If you've got a red flag, it's better to go in there and forget everything you think you know and start from scratch. So look at the paternal matches, sort them into groups according to which matches share DNA with each other, identify the ancestors shared by those matches, and then, and this is the technical part that maybe we can go into more detail in a future episode, she'll want to look at the quantity of DNA that her husband shares with these matches to determine whether it is possible that he is descended from the couples that she has identified.
Right. Before you go today, we have to play our quiz. Obviously, you can tell that I've spent a lot of time thinking about this quiz, Laura. It took me ages to come up with it. So, either or, would you rather have a newspaper record or a criminal record?
Newspaper.
Any reason why?
I think the criminal record can often be quite vague. It will just say larceny, or it will just say, stole a loaf of bread, and it doesn't really give you the story. Whereas the newspaper record will often provide sometimes more context than actually existed, but it's always interesting.
Okay, 1921 census or 1911 census?
1921 census.
Now, I am clearly the only person that's a massive fan of the 1911 census. I love it, but nobody seems to be sharing my passion for it. So why the 1921?
I love the 1911 census. I think probably the reason why a lot of people say 1921 is the novelty of it, isn't it? But what I love about the 1921 census is the description of the workplace and the address of the workplace, and having that little bit of extra information, knowing how they got to their job from their house to their job, and knowing how far away it was, and knowing the company is so much more context and more information than we're used to getting from a census. And I just really love that. And I've had more interesting, unexpected finds from the 1921 census as well. My great granddad actually wrote a little note on the bottom of his entry saying that he'd written it on behalf of mummy because she can't write much, which I just thought was so sweet. And it's so I've got a soft spot for the 1921 census because it brought me some nice finds.
Okay, civil registration or a parish record?
Civil registration.
Okay, why?
Because you know what? It depends on the record. If it's birth or baptism, I prefer birth because of the mother's maiden name. If it's marriage, I actually prefer parish because of the handwritten signatures. So it does depend. I love a handwritten signature. I love being able to see my ancestors' handwriting and knowing that they wrote that on that page. It's incredible.
Would you prefer in your family tree a member of the royal family or the gentry or a working class hero?
Working class hero, particularly if they were political. I haven't had anyone who was. My stepdad is so lucky; he had an ancestor who was really very socialist and left wing and upstanding and fought for workers' rights and made loads of speeches, and he's in the newspapers. And I'm so jealous of that ancestor. He's great, and I don't have anything like that. I don't have any upstanding political ancestors. So, yeah, I'd like that.
So you are such a good person, Laura. I want to literally float around in period costume like Jane Austen. So I would love somebody who lived in a stately home. Unfortunately, my family have no connection to stately homes. May have robbed one once, I don't know. But yeah, I would literally love to float around in period costume looking for Mr. Darcy.
I'm not saying I'd complain about a noble ancestor. I would take it. But yeah, if I had to choose.
And last question, if you could invite anybody from your family tree for dinner tonight, who would it be and why?
What a question. I think it would have to be my grandma, my mum's mum. And I have so many questions for her. She was, there's something special about anyone on your maternal line, I think, because they had the greatest impact on you, on your cultural upbringing, because that's your mother's mother or your mother's 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 mother. And so down that line, you've got all the people who had the greatest impact, usually the greatest impact on their children. And I didn't really get to know her. She died when I was 4. And I feel like I'm missing so much of my family story and of the context of my mum's life by not having spoken to her. And I want to ask her if she ever suspected that her dad wasn't her dad. I'm so curious about whether she ever had any sense that that was the case, because she certainly never gave anything away. So I think it would have to be, my mum's mum, my grandmother.
Laura, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about DNA, something that I think so many people now have taken DNA tests. I mean, every person you speak to, normally when I'm in a queue, people stop and talk to me about DNA and taking a DNA test. Don't forget, if you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe. And if you are listening to it via your usual podcast stations, please remember to download. Until next week, goodbye.